This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Teresa Morgan. Dr. Morgan is the McDonald Agape Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Yale Divinity School. During her prolific career, she has taught Greek and Roman history and has, in the last several years, published several works on the New Testament and theology, focusing on the language of faith in the New Testament. Her brand new book is called Trust and Atonement, God, Creation, and Reconciliation, out now on Eerdmans. In it, she offers a groundbreaking new model of atonement based on trust. We will be discussing this thought-provoking book on the show today. Dr. Morgan, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hello, Alex. It's a pleasure to be with you.
The book was really fascinating, and we were talking about this a little bit before the show. For a book on theology and biblical studies, you took it in some directions that I was not anticipating, so I'm very excited for everyone to hear what you have to say about that today. But before we start, just tell us a little about yourself, your background, and your work.
Okay, well, I'm British. I came to work in the US 2 years ago at Yale University. My extended family are still in the UK, so I still spend quite a bit of time there too. And originally, I studied classics and music, and then a bit later theology. And for many years, I taught Greek and Roman history at Oxford University. But at Yale, I teach New Testament and early Christian history and theology. And I'm also an Anglican priest. So I also usually work for a few hours a week in a parish church, whether in Oxford or here in New Haven.
That's perfect. Well, it makes sense that a classicist would make the shift into biblical studies and New Testament because there is a lot of overlap between those two disciplines. But what was it for you that motivated you to begin exploring that avenue more, to go from studying and teaching the Greek and Roman world generally to looking into Christian history and theology more specifically?
I think I was always interested in both. And I was ordained in 2002. So for many years, I was also looking for ways to sort of converge my research and my teaching in classics and in New Testament and theology. And so I started writing in New Testament and theology kind of alongside classics in the early 2000s. And then just gradually my interests in those fields overtook my work in Greek and Roman history, really. So now I don't very often write in straight Greek and Roman history.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what's really interesting about your work on theology and biblical studies is that it all kind of follows a series of themes that are really interesting to you. And in a lot of ways, Trust and Atonement is a culmination of some of the work that you've done over the last several years. The book is very unique in terms of theology and in terms of the arguments that you're making in this book. What motivated you at this point in your career to write Trust and Atonement?
Well, it's the outcome of quite a long story in a way. Back in 2015, I published a book called Roman Faith and Christian Faith. Now, that was about a cluster of concepts and practices which are described by the term fides in Latin, which will be familiar to many people, and pistis in Greek. And both of those have a wide range of meaning, but they center on trust, trustworthiness, faithfulness, good faith, entrustedness. Very relational terms. And they can actually also mean belief. And I was interested in how those ideas and practices work in the world of the early Roman Empire. And this book started out as a classics book. But what is especially interesting about pistis and fides is that they are also the terms that we come to translate belief and faith in a Christian context. But of course, Christian belief and faith mean something rather different from trust and faithfulness and good faith, or they mean more than that. So I wanted to know, how did it happen that one small group of people in the Roman Empire, namely Christians, took the everyday language of trust in their world and over time developed it into what we now think of as Christian faith and belief? And what I found was that in the earliest days of Christianity, Christian pistis and fides do actually mean very much what they meant in the contemporary world. That is, they center on relational trust and faithfulness and entrustedness, and sometimes also belief. But over time, Christian meanings of those terms just became richer and richer. So now faith encompasses many other things, from knowledge of God to confidence, hope, worship, prayer, the eyes of faith, the leap of faith, and the faith, meaning Christianity as a religion, So After I'd written that book, I began to think, if trust and faithfulness and entrustedness are really central to Christian faith at the roots of the tradition, then surely we should be thinking about them theologically as well as historically. And there is basically no theology of trust. It is just not an area in which theologians have written. So in 2022, I wrote another book called The New Testament and the Theology of Trust, exploring what trust might mean theologically rooted in the New Testament. And the book we're talking about today takes that project a bit further. And so specifically in this book, I focus on the cross, and especially on St. Paul's account of the cross and what it might mean to say that Jesus Christ reconciles humanity to God by restoring trust between them.
I want to talk about that term pistis in a little bit more detail, because there are, for people like you that teach Greek and Roman history, and then for people like me that have a background in biblical studies and that kind of understand how like the linguistic process works, it makes sense that a term like pistis could have a very dynamic meaning. But there are a lot of Christians that immediately balk at that, because this concept of faith is so central to at least certain quarters of Protestant Christianity. And so I know that on my show in the past, I've had Matthew Bates on, who's written some work that overlaps with yours. And I've been promoting like Nijay Gupta's work and things like that. But in some quarters of American Protestant Christianity, the idea that faith could mean something more nuanced than what we've traditionally been taught to believe about it is very, very controversial. So maybe just real quick, make the linguistic case. I know you touched on it a little bit in your previous answer, but make the linguistic case for why pistis shouldn't just be rendered faith in English translations of the New Testament, but that trust is actually probably a more close approximation of what that term means in English.
Well, I think the heart of it is that, I mean, you can translate pistis in New Testament writings as faith, but the thing is that what we understand by faith now is extremely rich. It just includes a whole lot of other things like the knowledge and hope and confidence and the leap of faith and the eyes of faith and worship and all those things. It just includes a lot of things that a close scrutiny of the earliest Christian writings show that it didn't mean for the very earliest Christians. So my point is not that faith is in a way a bad translation of pistis, but just that it's a more developed translation of pistis. Because in the world in which Christianity developed, Greek pistis, Latin fides, they centrally mean trust, relational trust and related ideas. And when I came to examine all the earliest Christian writings very closely, I concluded that actually for very early Christians, faith has this narrower meaning. Pistis, fides have this narrower meaning. So it's not that there's anything wrong with translating this language faith. The other aspect of this is that, of course, we very often nowadays translate pistis language or fides language belief specifically. And belief is one aspect of the whole complexity of faith. And it is a very specific aspect. And that particularly perhaps Protestant churches, Reformed churches, are very interested in belief, very committed to belief as the foundation of faith and of salvation of one's relationship with God and Christ and the Spirit. And the way that I would explain the difference in the ancient world is this. So in the everyday world of the Roman Empire, the polytheist world of the ancient Mediterranean, people believed that hundreds and thousands of gods existed. They didn't worship most of the gods they believed in, because many of those gods would be the gods of a different city or a different tribe or a different family or just a different patch of land, say. Or they would be gods you didn't happen to need at this moment, like a healing god, say. So there's a difference for people between believing that gods exist and believing certain things about the gods and worshipping, making a commitment to them. And in fact, the same thing is true in ancient Judaism. Jews believed that there was one God, one true and living God, the God of Israel, and they worshipped that God. But they also believed that there were angels and powers. They believed that Abraham and Enoch and others had been taken up to heaven. So they could believe a lot of things about heavenly beings without worshipping them. So there's a gap between belief and worship. So when early Christians talk about belief, and they talk about belief, pistis language, the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul summarizing, I preach to you that Jesus died, that he was raised, that he appeared to the apostles and so on. That's all about belief. But for Paul, believing certain things about God and about Christ is the prelude to putting your life in God's hands, in Christ's hands, giving yourself to them, putting your hope, putting all your, expectation of salvation into their hands. And that's a relational move. That's a whole life commitment. And the language that they used for that is pistis language in its relational meaning. So basically, belief leads to trust. Both of those things using pistis language. And there's a very nice, another very nice text in the New Testament which illustrates this very well. Think of the Epistle of James, chapter 2, verse 19, where the writer says, "You believe that God is one. Well done, you. Even the demons believe that and tremble." That captures exactly the difference I'm talking about between belief faith and trust faith, as it were. The demons believe that God is one. No doubt the demons believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, but they're not worshipping them. They're not worshipping God. And they're not making that whole life commitment. So demons believe, but they don't worship. They don't have faith. They don't put their trust in God. And when all New Testament and early Christian writers talk about that whole life commitment, they use pistis or fides language in that relational trust-based sense. So that's the thing for the very early Christians. Belief leads to trust, basically.
That is perfect. Well, that's the first half of the title of your book, Trust In, and the second half is Atonement. And I know you're a minister, so I'm sure you see this all the time. But I was grew up in a Lutheran church, and I remember being a teenager. And even as I was reading my Bible, I go to church on Sunday, and our pastor would always use these words like atonement that sounded very fancy and theological, but I never really actually knew what they meant, and I never really asked the question well, when he says this term, what is it like? What does it mean in particular? And we just kind of have this general sense for the word like atonement. Okay, it's something that has to do with Jesus and my sins, but I don't really know what it means beyond that. So you define atonement in your book, and you make the case that we actually have to have a very specific conception of atonement. So what does that concept mean, and why is it so central to Christian theology?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I completely agree with, your description of what it's like growing up in a church and hearing these words and you never really know what they mean. So the word atonement in English literally means at-one-ment. That's where it came from. It was coined in the early 16th century, as far as we can see, to mean at-one-ment. So when we talk about atonement as Christians, we're talking about how human beings can come back to being at one with God after they have sinned and become alienated from God, or indeed suffered and become alienated from God, which we might come back to. And so in those very broad terms, atonement means the same as salvation, essentially. But it's also used of particular ideas about how we are saved. So people talk about images or models or theories of atonement, which are theories about how we are saved by the grace of God through Jesus Christ. And atonement, in that sense, is central to Christian theology because it's the heart of the good news that Christians proclaim, that humanity is saved by God. God through Christ is reconciling the world to God's self, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. And God is making possible our salvation and our at-one-ment. And there's just one other thing I would say about atonement, because it is really very remarkable. And that is that no church has ever declared one particular theory of atonement or model of atonement canonical, orthodox, at the expense of all rest. There are many, many models of atonement, and no church has ever declared only one of them orthodox and said the rest are just wrong. Now, when we think about the history of Christianity, Christians have argued about almost everything, the nature of Christ, the nature of the Trinity, and all those things. People have said this theory is orthodox and that theory is unorthodox. This has never been true of atonement. And I think that is sort of the measure of what a deep mystery it is. And that for that reason, it is always possible to suggest a new model or a new image of atonement. And I think many, many models of atonement are actually helpful. And maybe some of them are helpful to some people and others are helpful to other people. Maybe some of them are helpful to us in one moment of our lives, and another model might be helpful in another moment of our lives. So my hope in developing a trust-based model of atonement is not to supplant existing models. It's to add something to a whole range of different ways that we approach what at the end of the day is a great mystery.
The first time that I'd ever thought about this was, I guess it's probably, I don't know, it was like maybe 13 or 14 years ago. Michael Gorman wrote a book on atonement where he looked at like kind of the three main models within historical Christianity, which is like, substitutionary atonement, Christus Victor, and the moral influence model. And he does exactly what you do there. He argues that actually all three of them are kind of compatible and make sense in different places in the New Testament. So you're absolutely right. Like, by proposing a new model of atonement, it doesn't mean that you're trying to cancel out the other ones. And as you make the point in your book, there are a lot of different ways in which the writers of the New Testament conceptualize how this atonement works. The upshot of your thesis is that you propose explicitly that the language of trust in the New Testament could and should provide us with a new model of atonement. So walk us through kind of that central thesis. How does trust relate to the idea of atonement?
Yeah, so my interpretation is particularly based on the thinking of Paul. And on a rather long and detailed exegesis of Romans 3 and Galatians 2 and Philippians 3, which are passages where Paul talks about what God does through Christ through the cross. And I'm not going to walk you through every step of that sort of exegesis because it would take all day. But in essence, sort of the idea is that Paul talks about God. First of all, Paul talks about God as pistos, faithful and trustworthy to humanity. And that's an idea he gets from the Hebrew Bible, where God is often said to be faithful or trustworthy to Israel. Paul also talks about God working through Christ and through what he calls pistis Christou. Now, that little phrase, which is much discussed, can mean either the faithfulness or trustworthiness of Christ to God, or our trust or faith in Christ. And people have argued about which of those translations is right. So does Christ save us by being faithful to God or by our putting faith in him? And there are strong arguments for both interpretations, and I think both interpretations are right. I think that's why there are strong arguments on both sides. So my argument is that where this phrase appears in those three letters, God is faithful and trustworthy to Jesus Christ, as God is to all humanity. Jesus is faithful and trustworthy to God as God's Son, and God and Jesus are both also faithful and trustworthy to us. And when we respond to their trust and belief in us by believing and trusting in them, that is when we are righteous and we can hope to be saved. So that is the basis of my model of how at-one-ment happens through trust. And in fact, I think there are strong signs that Jesus restores the relationship between God and humanity in every aspect of his earthly life and his work, in his death and resurrection, and in his exalted life. I wouldn't want to rule out any aspect of Jesus's life or death or heavenly life as salvific. But of course, from the Bible onwards, the death of Jesus has played a central role in many people's understanding of atonement, and especially in Western churches in the modern world. And that's why this book focuses on the cross and how Jesus works to restore trust between God and humanity, sort of specifically on the cross.
I do want to ask you a side question about that, because I did laugh a little bit when I read your book, because I do think that you kind of very casually solve the pistis Christou debate, which has been very contentious over the last several years. And it's like you said, there have been a lot of books that have been arguing kind of both sides of that. Have you gotten any pushback or any feedback from any other New Testament scholars or theologians about your employment of pistis Christou language to mean actually both the objective and the subjective?
Yeah. Well, if it sounded casual in this new book, that's because in the book Roman Faith and Christian Faith, I talked about this at great length because it is a real kind of crux of interpretation. Well, I think as you would expect, that model has had various different responses. So a lot of people have liked it. Quite a lot of people like the idea of just sort of solving the crux, really, by saying, right, actually, everybody has a point here. But some people who are particularly firmly committed to one view or the other, are not going to be persuaded. So yeah, I've had sort of the usual mixed response, I think. But I think quite a lot of people quite like the idea that we might be able to resolve the tension by saying actually both of the traditional interpretations have a lot going for them.
That's perfect. Well, and you did a great job of explaining the mechanics of how this model would work. I guess the next question and the question I think that's just as equally significant is the why question. Why is it that the writers of the New Testament think that we can trust Jesus as the mediator between God and humanity? Like, why do they think that what happened with him and his life and his death and his resurrection is the thing that bridges that gap between us and God?
Yeah. So I'll try to say a little bit about that, and then I should also say a little bit more about the cross itself and kind of how the cross works as a place where trust is restored, because that's kind of the other piece of the core of the argument, I guess. But your first point about, as it were, why it is that Jesus should be trustworthy, and this is something that I argue shows in every aspect of Jesus's life and work, and every aspect of people's engagement with him. So people who encounter Jesus in his earthly life and work, they have the experience. Karl Barth, I think, puts it wonderfully when he says that in having to do with Jesus, we have to do with God. And I think that's exactly what a lot of people experienced who encountered Jesus in his earthly life, that they encountered an extraordinary teacher, an extraordinary healer, an exorcist, somebody who simply changed the world for them, changed the world for them, what they saw of the world, what they hoped for themselves and for the world, really changed their whole sense of human identity and trajectory and hope. And that seems to have been just an ungainsayable experience of many people who encountered Jesus. And then, of course, there was the horror and the shock, the utter shock of his betrayal and his crucifixion. But then his closest followers, at least perhaps quite a lot of his followers, again had this ungainsayable experience of him risen. And I don't think we can doubt that something happened to Jesus's followers. They had an experience which was simply, couldn't be doubted, really, of Jesus alive, Jesus living, Jesus with God, Jesus undamaged by the crucifixion, in his essence, in his self. And they continue to have the experience of Jesus exalted in heaven with God, but still with them. And people reflected on all those experiences in light of the scriptures, which is all Jesus's earliest followers, whom we know of, at least by name, were Jewish. And they all knew the scriptures. They reflected on everything that they experienced of Jesus in light of the scriptures and putting those things together, putting experience and the scriptures and thinking about the scriptures and their own experience of how their lives changed when they began to follow Jesus, putting all those things together. That whole nexus of things is what brought people to be convinced that salvation was through Jesus Christ. It's that entire range of experience, that the way that what you experience of him, what you experience of your life as different when you meet him, and how that fits with the tradition that you've received.
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go on. Oh, well, I was going to go on just to say a little bit more about the cross itself, if that's okay,
yeah.
because that's another, that's obviously, the other kind of key piece of the central argument here. And again, this is very much drawing on Paul, who, as everybody knows, is for whom the cross is enormously important. Paul may not have known very much about Jesus's earthly life and ministry. He certainly doesn't talk very much about it. He does talk a great deal about the cross and the resurrection. So the cross for him is absolutely central. And what I have suggested is that on the cross, Jesus turns the cross, which is a place where human beings have done the worst they can do to each other and have suffered to the depths that are possible for humanity. Jesus turns the cross into a space where God and he say together, there is nothing you can do as a human being, nothing you can do and nothing that you can suffer that will separate you from God, that will make God abandon you. And on the cross, God is here in this place, offering love and healing and hope and trusting you to respond. And if you will respond to this grace with trust, with at least a first step of trust, then God will lead you out of that place and into a new life. So the cross is the revelation of God's and Christ's trust and confidence in humanity. And it is the revelation of humanity to itself. Actually, one of the most important things about the cross is that it reveals humanity to itself, that there is nothing that humanity can do that will make us unlovable and unsavable by God. This is how precious we are to God. And if we can respond to that outreach, even with the thinnest, most fragile, most provisional trust, then God will bring us to new life, new hope, new expectation. And many people may hear that, perhaps especially in Reformed traditions, and ask, and what is the role of grace in that model? Because in most modern accounts of atonement, the role of divine grace is immensely important. And it is for me too. And I am suggesting that grace is essential here. It is grace that creates that space where trust can begin. It's grace that offers trust for us to respond to. I do think we have to respond. I think actually any model of salvation, one way or another, says that we have to respond, unless you are a double determinist. But any model short of double determinism says that we have to respond. But without that grace, without that outreach of grace, we would be trapped indefinitely in our conflict and our suffering and our alienation from God.
Yep, I think that's beautifully put. And you perfectly anticipated the question that I was going to ask you about this. So this does very much relate to traditional models of substitutionary atonement. And Jesus had to go through that ordeal in order to restore the trust between God and humanity. One of the really interesting things, now that we've kind of set up your model and explored it theologically and biblically, one of the really interesting things that you do in your book is you look at how trust works itself out in other areas of life outside of systematic theology and outside of biblical studies. And when I got your book to look at as a pre-order, it was just really, really interesting because there were a couple of chapters that I just did not anticipate would be in your book. And one of those chapters is chapter 2, where you look at how trust can transform damaged relationships. And you give like real world examples of that, drawing from, politics and psychology and sociology. So you're taking all of this information from disciplines outside of theology and biblical studies. And I thought that was a really fascinating way of approaching it. So give us some examples. How does trust, like in the tangible world that we can see today, how does trust restore these damaged relationships between human beings and communities?
Yeah. One of the things that I was concerned about when I started working on this is that trust is so ubiquitous in our lives. We actually depend on it all the time to such a degree. It is actually quite difficult to see how it operates in our lives in some ways, and appreciate just how important, how powerful it is. So I was looking, as I was starting to work on the theology of trust, I was looking for scholarship in other areas that would help me to show just how powerful trust is. And I was delighted to discover that there is really a lot of research in sociology and in psychology, people working on trauma, people working with ex-convicts and so on. There's a lot of work in different fields on how important the restoration of trust is for bringing people together who have been alienated either by sin or by suffering. And 3 areas that I really homed in on. There's a lot of work on the role of trust in restoring societies after war and conflict. There's a lot of work in psychology on the importance of restoring trust when people have survived serious trauma. And there is some very interesting work on the role of trust in rehabilitating people who have been to prison. So, for instance, it is now very common for people who work on conflict resolution in different parts of the world to talk about how each side in a conflict has to be willing, right at the beginning of a process of reconciliation, people have to be willing to risk at least very, what people call thin, limited trust in the other side, so that they can at least maybe meet and start to talk, maybe agree a ceasefire, say, as a first step. And then the hope is that they can extend and sort of thicken their trust until it allows them to do more together, eventually to make peace and begin to live together again. Though, of course, that can be a very long process. In a very different sphere, When people have suffered trauma or abuse, they often find it very difficult to trust anybody, actually. That is a well-recognized consequence of suffering and abuse. But of course, to live well, to do all kinds of really fundamental everyday things, just looking forward, planning for the future in our lives, we actually have to be able to trust people. And so survivors of trauma have to find a way to learn to trust and also to be trustworthy, to be trustable. And often they do that with the help of a mediator, a therapist or some other kind of mediator, which is exactly what I argue humanity as a whole is doing with the help of Jesus Christ. Or in yet another context, there are these studies of people coming out of prison who face a huge barrier to becoming part of wider society because people don't trust them. And often they don't trust other people either, because people who break the law have often actually suffered or been abused themselves in the past. So there's a failure of trust on all sides. But if ex-prisoners are going to survive and stay out of jail, they have to learn to trust and to be trustworthy. And society has to learn to trust them, say by giving them a job. And again, that kind of trust can start off very thin, very limited, but you hope that it can grow and strengthen through time. And there are some remarkable examples of Christian organizations actually acting as mediators in that process and helping ex-convicts to trust and be trusted in the places where they live and therefore to thrive. And so all those areas, they're just really interesting areas of research, completely unconnected to theology or the study of religion, but which show how powerful trust is in restoring relationships. And that's just what I wanted people to kind of capture, to grasp about my model of trust in atonement.
You also explore another really interesting avenue where you talk about, and you don't shy away from this, and something I really appreciate about this book is that you explain how suffering and wrongdoing are just a part of the human experience. Like, we can't escape that as human beings. And you look at the way that it impacts the relationships that we have with one another, but you also make the case that human suffering and wrongdoing can impact the relationship that we have with God. Like, it damages the trust between humanity and God. So how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, I mean, when we think as Christians about what can go wrong between God and humanity, we just very often focus on the idea that human beings commit sort of deliberate sins, willful sins against God. And many models of atonement, especially the classic models, are about how God through Christ restores people who have willfully sinned. But I think that in everyday experience, we all know that deliberate wrongdoing is only one of many ways that we can fall apart from each other and also from God. We can wrong somebody accidentally or just out of stupidity, carelessness, because we have bad habits, because we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. But also, of course, when other people hurt us, we often don't want to be close to them anymore. So suffering drives people apart as much as wrongdoing does. And suffering can also drive people away from God. And we see that happen all the time. People suffer terribly and they say, I lost my faith. Why would God do this to me? So both suffering and all kinds of wrongdoing are part of our experience. They can all damage trust. And that is true, I think, both between human beings and between people and God. And so I suggest that a strong model of atonement should really be able to show how God, through Christ, seeks to restore both people who have done wrong in all sorts of ways and people who have suffered, because both of those groups of people are alienated from God. And in fact, I think when we look closely at both the Old and the New Testaments, there's actually a wealth of language which talks about this. There's all sorts of stories that show very complex, nuanced sense of the ways that we can do wrong, and the ways that we can suffer, and the ways that both of those things interact with each other and drive us apart from each other and from God. Going right back to Adam and Eve in the garden, there are just so many stories that show how complex the relationship between sin and suffering and alienation from God is. So I think there is ample material in the Bible to support this idea that both wrongdoing and suffering drive us away from God. And so it follows that the work of God through Christ should reach out both to those who have done wrong and to those who have suffered.
I love that you deal with the complexity of trust in your book. And this is one of the things about, I'm born and raised in Kentucky. And so we have, not in any of the churches that I've been to, but there is kind of like that stereotypical Southern preacher that says that, if you put your faith, your trust in God, that everything's going to be perfect and all you have to do is believe and all of your relationships are going to be healed. And you just got to trust in God and have that unwavering kind of loyalty to God, and your life will be fine and everything will be changed. But it doesn't actually work that way in the real world. And you talk about the complexity of trust, and you've kind of already alluded to the idea that in the restoration of trust between human beings, sometimes that trust begins and is very, very thin. There might not be a lot that you're starting with a little bit of it. And one of the best quotes that you had in the book, and I wrote it down here, it's on page 71 of your book. And this is what you say about the complexity of trust. You say, trust is complicated, demanding, and insecure, often for understandable reasons. And until the end of time, it is likely to remain so. I think it's very powerful and very realistic. Just talk to us about that statement there. Why is trust so complex, and why will it probably be complex until the eschaton?
Yeah. Well, I think that preachers are right when they call us to strong, unshakable trust. I think that's the ideal. But I also think that in practice, that may be really quite a high bar. It's a very demanding ideal, The trouble is, trust is complicated, partly because by definition, you have to trust when you don't know for sure. If you know something is true, if you know something is reliable, you don't need to trust. You know. In trust, it comes in a sense, precisely when we don't know everything about a person, we don't know everything about a situation. So it's always a risk, and that means there's always fragility about it. But also, of course, you can trust in many different ways in different situations. If I go to buy a loaf of bread from you, and I hand over my dollars and I trust that you will give me a loaf of bread, I can't be certain that you will, but you did yesterday, so I'm going to trust that you're going to do it again. That's a real form of trust, but it's a very specific, limited form of trust. I don't need to know a lot about you except you're a baker. I don't need to trust a lot about you except that you have been known to give bread for dollars. And that's the kind of thin, practical trust, which we all practice every day. But then, of course, suppose I get married. I have to be able to trust my partner that he won't be unfaithful to me or take all our money and run away or hurt our children. Now, that is a much, much bigger, thicker, further reaching, more complicated kind of trust. For that, I need to try to know my partner much better, but I'll never know everything about another person. So it's still trust, What if I'm living in a war zone, if I'm in fear of my life, and you offer to get me out if I give you all my money? Do I trust you? Can I afford not to trust you? How do I decide? So there are so many different situations in which different kinds of trust are operating. And in our lives, we all we're all in different situations all the time in which we are also putting our trust in God. And that's partly why it's complicated. It's not just a matter of trusting God and everything will be fine. It's a matter of, but what about, how do I trust in God in this situation? How do I trust in God in that situation? Because every situation and every aspect of a relationship is different. So trust it's a very complex thing. And it is always based on ultimately a degree of uncertainty or a degree of mystery. So we have experiences, we reflect on our experiences, we listen to teaching, an example of people who have trusted in God before us. We believe and we trust, but we know that there is always a degree of kind of jeopardy in that. And by the way, I think God takes a risk on us too. God has to trust us too. Don't you think? Don't you think that by sending into the world a very non-traditional kind of Messiah, God is taking a tremendous risk of putting a tremendous act of trust in human beings? If God wanted to make an absolutely unmistakable impression on humanity, then God would do what Zechariah looks forward to: go and stand on the Mount of Olives and just, reveal God's self in glory. Everybody will know. There will be no possibility of mistake. God doesn't do that. He sends someone who is not a king, someone who is not a warrior, someone who is not an angel, a Messiah who is a Galilean craftsman. That's a colossal act of trust in humanity, to be able to encounter God in humanity, in the world, and respond. It's extraordinary. But because Jesus is a very atypical Messiah, that also means that humanity's got to take a great step of trust. Because it's one thing to recognize God revealed in glory, it's another thing to recognize God in Christ. So there's tremendous trust on both sides here.
Yeah, well, and that reminds me of Genesis as well, because again, like in Genesis, God creates this very good world, and then he gives human beings, or he creates human beings in his image and likeness, and then gives them dominion over creation. And that has always just been a really powerful scene in Genesis for me, just thinking about like the nature of our responsibility towards God's created order, and the fact that like even though we have pretty much done nothing but screw it up as human beings, God continues to try to restore that relationship of trust with us. It's very powerful to think about it like that. And
yeah, what an act of trust. There are Adam and Eve, they're 5 minutes old. What an act of trust. It's great.
Well, and that actually leads perfectly to my next question, and what I think was probably the most interesting chapter in your book, or at least the one that was the most unique in a study like this, where you talk about how, or the possibility of creation itself being reconciled to God through trust. And you actually dive into kind of the science behind plants and animals, and you look at the way that human beings interact with plants and animals, and the way that plants and animals interface with the rest of creation. I'm not a science guy. I have a very rudimentary understanding of biology, so it's fascinating for me to read through that chapter. And in reality, I didn't even have, I guess, the right language to ask an intelligent sounding question about this, but talk to us about like what can we learn from the plant animal world as it relates to your thesis about God's reconciliation through trust?
Well, I'm not a scientist either, so I found this absolutely fascinating literature. So eco-theologians nowadays talk a lot about how non-human creation suffers when human beings abuse it, not surprisingly. But there is also an increasing research in animal and plant sciences about what are known as altruism and spite in the non-human world. Now, we've probably encountered stories about altruism, particularly perhaps in the animal kingdom. This is, animals doing, or even plants doing good to one another when without any direct benefit to themselves. But spite in this context is the idea that some non-human beings are capable of deliberately doing wrong to each other when they don't need to. And some animals, at least, some animal scientists have argued, may even have the capacity to know when they're doing wrong. So I was interested in this book in whether we could imagine the non-human world, which is also capable of suffering, also being capable of wrongdoing, and whether we could imagine the non-human world as also coming to at-one-ment with God through Christ alongside humanity. Can we imagine extending a model of atonement to the non-human world? So one way, so I've explored various possibilities for this, but one way I suggest that it might happen is by human beings mediating between Christ and the rest of creation, as Christ mediates between God and us, by being trusting and trustworthy to the rest of creation. Now, I think that's quite a challenge because, you might say there are quite a lot of reasons currently for the rest of creation not really to trust human beings. Currently, rather a bad track record in our relation to the environment. But I think it is not unthinkable that humanity might come to, in a sense, model Christ to the rest of creation by being trusting and trustworthy and encouraging non-human creation to respond. But also, actually, at the same time, I think that humanity now can draw inspiration from the plant and animal kingdoms. When you hear a story about a dog risking its own life to save the life of another dog that has got stuck on a freeway, or when you hear about fir trees in forests who feed deciduous birch trees in winter with sugars to keep them healthy. And then when the summer comes and the birch trees are making lots and lots of sugars themselves, they give them back. They return them to the fir trees. Extraordinary kind of symbiosis, This makes me wonder whether plants and animals are sometimes already more Christ-like than we are. Maybe we should not just hope to represent Christ to them, but maybe we should also be allowing them to represent Christ to us. And that might be part of our ongoing relationship with the natural world.
I love that. Well, chapter 5 in your book is very powerful. And I think the one that, in terms of putting this into practice, might be the most difficult for us. And this is the restoration of trust between people. Now, what's really funny, or I guess ironic about this, is that we're recording this on election day. And it doesn't really matter what your political background is. But if you turn on the news, it's pretty obvious that people don't trust each other in general, right? So there's a lot of trust that needs to be restored throughout the world between human beings. So how does this process of restoring trust work? And in your book, you talk about it in those terms. You say that the only way that human beings can be reconciled with each other is through a process of trust. It's not something that you can wave a magic wand and just have it happen magically. It takes time and effort. So based on everything and all the research that you've done for this book, how can we begin to engage in that process of restoring trust between human beings?
Yeah, it is sort of the big one in the world that we're living in, I think, isn't it? I wanted to talk in this chapter about how individual Christians, but also churches, communities, may be able to work to create the same kind of place of trust for other people to come to reconciliation with each other or with God as Jesus Christ creates for us on the cross. How can we follow Christ by making our communities the kind of place where trust can take place, that Christ makes the cross? And I think a really important first step in this is to recognize that just as reconciliation between God and humanity happens through Christ, in other words, it's a triangular relationship, so the restoration of trust between human beings is also a triangular relationship. It takes place with Christ in the middle of it, and it takes place on the basis of our trust in Christ. And just as the strength of the relationship between God and Christ makes Christ able to reach out to humanity, so if we hope to follow that example, I think the strength of our relationship with God and Christ has to be what enables us to reach out to other people. So one important thing, I think, when we reflect, for instance, on forgiveness in the Lord's Prayer, when we talk about forgiveness as Christian people, strangely, I'm not sure that we always remember that God and Christ are always involved in that process. I think we sometimes talk as if you as an individual just have to learn to forgive me. I have to just learn to forgive you. I have to make it happen, as if it happens purely between us. I think that's too high a bar. I think that's too demanding for most people, most of the time. Anything we do out of our relationship with Christ, and we do in the recognition of the kind of unqualified love and trust of God and Christ in us, which gives us great strength, great resources in our background for reaching out with trust. Because it is much, much easier to reach out to trust another person if you feel strong, if you feel rooted yourself. So our relationship with God and with Christ is the basis for our relationships of forgiveness with each other, and that's a really important thing. In terms of sort of individuals and communities offering sort of spaces where people can meet each other and also meet God, knowing that the place itself is a safe place, they won't be hurt when they're there. I think this is a real aspiration, both for Christian individuals and for Christian communities. And there are some extraordinary examples of Christian communities trying to do that. And I've given in the book the example of the Corrymeela community in Northern Ireland, which is an ecumenical Christian, Catholic and Protestant community, which it began in the 60s, before there was very much work on trust being done, and certainly before there was any theology of trust, but they have always explicitly talked about themselves as creating a space where people can meet and begin to trust each other. Initially people on all sides of the Northern Ireland conflict. So they talk about themselves out of their Christian commitment as trying to create a space where people can meet and begin to talk, begin to worship, begin to pray together. And by that means, just begin to establish, at first, kind of thin and limited trust, with a view to sort of growing that trust over time. And I also suggest that individuals and churches can sometimes kind of stand as surrogates for somebody who can't be there in a space of the restoration of trust and forgiveness. So, for instance, if one person has badly hurt another person, and the person who has been hurt wants to be healed of that hurt, wants to learn to trust again, but the person who has hurt them might have died or moved away, or maybe just so dangerous that the person who has suffered can't be in a room with them, So then what is the person who has suffered to do, really? Well, a church or a community might be able to offer a trustworthy place where that person can go to learn to trust other people. And they can act as a kind of surrogate in the process of reconciliation. And where, and by that means, somebody who has been damaged or who has done wrong, can perhaps hope to grow in trust enough to go on to live well in the world. So in all those ways, I'm hoping that Christian individuals and churches can act as kind of places where the restoration of trust can happen.
That's a perfect segue to my last couple of questions. So it was all very, very powerful. You are in a unique position because you are both a scholar and a minister. So you kind of inhabit both of those worlds, both the theoretical and the practical. What impact do you want this book to have on Christian theological discussion from an academic standpoint? And then what impact would you want your study to have on the church?
Yeah, I hope that this work will help theologians and churches and people of faith to think more about the role of trust in the relationship between God and Christ and humanity, and between human beings in our faith and in our lives. So I really would like to kind of highlight the importance of trust as a theological theme and as a really central theological aspect of all of our lives and work. And I hope I have, in this process, perhaps given people some resources to help them think about how they practice trust in God and Christ. And also, and this is something we haven't touched on very much, but it's also important, I think, that the language of trust can also refer to entrustedness. And I think there are all sorts of ways in which people of faith are entrusted with work by God and Christ to do for the world, entrusted with stewardship, with love, with care, with preaching, with healing. We are entrusted with gifts and with responsibilities. So I'd like this work also to help us think about how we are entrusted as well as how we trust in God and Christ. In a way that, with any luck, is helpful, becomes part of our lives of faith and our lives working for God in the world. And over the years that I've now been writing and talking about trust as part of faith, people have told me that they find it helpful. And there's a conversation that over the years I've had with quite a few of my parishioners, because people will sometimes come to me and say, I say the Nicene Creed every week, but I know that I don't really understand it all. I know that the way it's written is partly sort of for historical reasons. I know it came out of a sort of historical process, but I don't really know very much about that historical process. So I worry. People worry. They say, I'm not absolutely sure that I believe it all, or quite how I should understand it to believe it all. So should I be saying it? That's quite a common worry. And I say, well, the word I believe translates the Greek verb pisteuein, but that word also means I trust and I am faithful. So can you say, I trust in God, I trust in Christ and the Spirit? Can you say, I want to be faithful to God and Christ and the Spirit? And the other person will almost always say, oh, yes, I can say that. Yes, I'm definitely trying to do that. And then I would say, well, I think you're fine. I think you're okay. So I think there are ways in which thinking of faith in terms of trust as well as belief is actually quite helpful to people.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, I got one more question for you that I ask every single time I have someone on my show that's written a work of theology. And this was, I was completely unaware of this until I went to school and started my degree in biblical studies. There is within academia a giant disciplinary split between theology and biblical studies. And sometimes that split can be incredibly antagonistic. Speaking about trust, biblical scholars don't trust theologians, and sometimes theologians don't trust biblical scholars. And a lot of Christians don't understand that is a very, very real thing in academia. But in your work, you kind of address that, and you kind of address the interrelationship between both of those disciplines. So I just want to ask you that as we close out today, what is the proper relationship between theology and biblical studies?
Well, as you know, and as your contributors know, there are a lot of things you could say about that. And I would say there is not one proper relationship. There are a lot of different ways that they relate to each other. And there are many ways they can relate to each other productively, as well as some ways that they relate to each other not always very productively in the academy. But I will mention one thing that is very important to me as somebody who writes both history and theology. And that is, when we study the history of Christianity, or we study, say, the New Testament historically, we quite often find ideas that the developing tradition has forgotten, or maybe just sort of marginalized, but which might actually seem interesting and helpful and sometimes really important. And I think that the central role of trust in God and Christ and entrustedness by God and Christ at the roots of the tradition is one of those ideas. It's an idea that is there in very early Christianity. It's there in the Bible, and the tradition has just a bit forgotten it. And so by studying faith language historically, I really hope that I have sort of recovered for the church now something that is also important theologically, and that therefore we can also think about theologically. So that's one way that history and theology relate, which is very important to me.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Teresa Morgan, I've really appreciated talking with you today. The book is Trust and Atonement. It's out now on Eerdmans Press. I would highly recommend everybody to go out and buy a copy of that. Before I let you go today, where can people follow you and find your work?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not on most social media. You can find my books in all good online and physical bookshops. You can now read some of my sort of short essays for free on Substack too.
All right, perfect. I'm going to put links to all of that stuff in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Alex. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.